2,000 people watched me quit my corporate job to build my first video game. And then the comments started coming in. At first, I was so excited. People were actually interested in this completely crazy thing I had decided to do. But then I noticed that several comments were telling me the same thing. My game is way too ambitious. Which is basically a polite way of saying, girl, you have no idea what you're doing. And honestly, they're not wrong. I don't know how to code. I've never made a video game. I don't have a development team or a massive budget. I'm working from a 16GB M1 Mac. And for some reason, out of every possible first game I could have chosen, I chose an online multiplayer FPS. Why did I do that to myself? So now I have to ask myself a slightly terrifying question. Did I quit a stable corporate career to pursue a dream that is literally impossible? I think those comments affected me more than I expected. Not because they were necessarily mean. Most of them were actually trying to help me. But because they confirmed something I was already afraid of. I don't come from money. I don't have a prestigious game development degree. I can't just hire a studio to transform everything in my imagination into a real game. And when you want to do something this unconventional, there's always that little voice asking, who do you think you are? Maybe people like me are allowed to play games, imagine games, and talk about games. But actually creating one, maybe that's reserved for people who started coding when they were 12. People who went to the right schools, people who already know the right people, people who are actually qualified to do this. And for a moment, I genuinely wondered if I was being completely delusional. But then I started thinking about everything else I've done without feeling fully qualified first. I moved countries. I built a career in industries I hadn't specifically studied for. I learned how to coordinate huge projects by being thrown into them and figuring things out as I went. Most of the time, I didn't begin because I already knew everything. I began by identifying the next thing I needed to learn. So maybe I was asking myself the wrong question. Maybe the question isn't, am I qualified to build my dream game? Maybe the real question is, what is the smallest version of this dream that I could actually learn how to build? Because in my imagination, the game already feels real. It's a competitive FPS set inside a beautiful but unsettling world. There are female characters, weapons, maps, online matches, and an entire world lore behind it. In my head, I can see everything. The problem is that every idea requires something I don't know how to do. Character modeling, animation, level design, servers, sound, combat, coding. That's a good one. Basically everything. And apparently having a cool idea is not the same thing as knowing how to make it exist. So where does someone like me actually start? I started looking into what professional game developers do before they create the characters, build the maps, or make everything look beautiful. And I realized that they don't necessarily begin by making the game. They begin by defining it. What experience are they promising the player? What will the player actually do? What makes the game different? What are the biggest risks? What does the game absolutely need? And most importantly, what are they deliberately choosing not to make? Apparently, you're not supposed to begin with the name, the lore, and the visual identity. I may have already done all those things because obviously that's the fun part. But the real first step is pre-production, which means that my first game development task wasn't learning how to code. It was learning how to make decisions. So I created my first sprint, vision and scope. Before cutting anything, I needed to understand what I was actually trying to protect. For me, it came down to three things. First, the gunplay needs to feel tactical. Favorite part. Aim, decisions, and teamwork should matter more than throwing abilities everywhere and hoping something works. Second, the world needs to feel beautiful and slightly disturbing. And third, I want to create a competitive space designed with women in mind. A place where we can communicate, improve, and take the game seriously without constantly having to defend our presence. Those became my three design pillars: the gunplay, the world, and the community. Every feature I imagine now has to support at least one of those things. If it doesn't support the gameplay, the identity, or the community, it probably doesn't belong in the game yet. But figuring out what I wanted to keep was the easy part. The painful part was deciding what I was willing to cut. And naturally, I wanted all of it immediately. But my first prototype doesn't need to prove that I can build an entire online game. It only needs to prove that the central idea could be fun. So multiple finished characters later. Several maps later. Competitive ranks and matchmaking much later. Cosmetics, battle passes, cinematics, and final voice acting, definitely not right now. I'm separating the dream game from the first playable version. So this enormous online VPN became one gray box arena. One objective site, one placeholder character, one weapon, and eventually 2 connected players. That's it. And I know that doesn't sound nearly as exciting. Adding 10 beautiful characters probably won't save it. And if that one interaction is fun, then I'll finally have something worth expending. But even after reducing the scope, I still had another problem. How does someone with zero experience turn one tiny prototype into a real online game? And this is where my old corporate life came back to haunt me. Because the career I had just escaped gave me exactly the skill I needed. I divided the journey into 24 sprints. The first sprints take me from an idea to a very basic offline FPS prototype. I need to learn Unreal Engine, create movement, add one weapon, and build a simple life and death loop. Then I can begin testing multiplayer, connecting 2 players, replicating combat, creating a basic online match. Only after those things work do I begin adding the elements that make the game: the characters, the environment, the sound, and the visual effects. And only after the game actually works do I reach servers, testing, optimization, and an early access release. According to my very optimistic little database, that journey could take me until the end of 2027. With a more realistic beginning buffer, probably early 2028. Will this timeline survive contact with reality? Probably not. Some sprints will take much longer than expected. Some tutorials will probably make me cry. There will be things I don't understand, systems I have to rebuild, and moments when I question all my life choices again. But this roadmap isn't supposed to perfectly predict the future. It's there to stop me from waking up every day and asking, how am I supposed to build an online multiplayer FPS? Now I only have to ask, what do I need to learn next? A calendar doesn't magically make the game possible. It just makes the next problem visible. And before I could move on to Unreal Engine, I needed to finish Sprint 1. By the end of this sprint, I needed to know who the game is for, what experience I'm promising, what the player actually does during a match, what the game absolutely needs, what is officially forbidden from entering the first prototype, and how I'll know if that prototype succeeds. My first definition of success is now extremely simple. 2 players can enter the same basic match. Both players understand what happened, and ideally, they want to play again. That may not sound like the revolutionary dream game I introduced in my first video, but it would be the first real evidence that this idea can exist outside of my imagination. For the first time, I don't just have a game idea, I have a testable idea. So were the comments right? Yes. The complete vision of my dream game is impossible for me to build right now. One complete beginner cannot immediately create characters, maps, servers, matchmaking, animations, weapons, and an entire competitive community. But I think I misunderstood what people were telling me. They weren't saying give up. They were saying make the first version smaller. I don't need to know how to build all of today. I only need to know what I'm building next. And now I do. The next sprint is Unreal Foundations, which means I finally have to open Unreal Engine on my 16GB M1 Mac. And based on what the launcher has already told me, that may become an entirely different crisis. But before that, I want to know what you would have kept. If you had to cut everything from your dream project except one idea, what would be impossible for you to remove? One sprint finished. 23 to go.